It's a real honor to be asked to give one of the Moses Greeley Parker lectures. Moses Greeley Parker, his burial place is on the cemetery tour I give at the Lowell Cemetery, so I've learned quite a bit about him. Today's topic, though, isn't about Moses Greeley Parker or medicine, which was his field. It's about the law and Lowell and the law. Now, like in any other project like this, you spend months and months and months accumulating material, and then you spend a week or two at the end trying to figure out what you're going to do with all that material you have, so it becomes a process of selecting it. If any one of the lawyers certainly in here got up and gave the same talk, they might choose different individuals to talk about. But I think maybe this would be the roots of maybe a book about the Lowell legal community. So if anyone has suggestions when I'm done my remarks, I'd be glad to hear other individuals that you would like to learn more about. I've become a big believer in place, the importance of place. We all live somewhere, we all have roots in the community. And so what I'd like to do is start the talk about the places in Lowell where the business of the law is transacted. Now, before Lowell became Lowell, back into the 18th century and the early 19th century, justice locally was administered by justices of the peace. They weren't lawyers usually, and there was no formal place for them to hold court. Sometimes they would have hearings in their living rooms. Sometimes they would have them in public spaces, in hotels or bars. Now, obviously, that's not the great, although some of the litigants and the lawyers might prefer that, but it's really not the type of atmosphere that's conducive to the administration of justice. So Lowell received its town charter in 1826, and it was just 7 years later, in 1833, that the state legislature created a police court here in Lowell. It authorized the governor to appoint a judge to be in charge of the police court. And because judges back then mostly worked part-time and continued their law practice, it also authorized the appointment of 2 special judges who would hear cases when the main judge had a conflict. Another provision of this authorizing legislation was that the town of Lowell provide suitable space for the court. And the town did that. Lowell didn't become a city till 1836 by the Market Building on what was then called Lowell Street, we know as Market Street today. This building was constructed to house the city market. It was kind of like what we would think of as a farmer's market today, but people at the time weren't, they still had to wait another century and a half for grocery stores, so it really didn't work too well. So the city owned this building. In 1837, they actually deeded a portion of the building. It was sort of a condominium, a large room on the second floor and offices on the second floor and the third floor to Middlesex County for use as the police court. Included in the transaction was a stove for warming the space, a carpet, and a number of tables. Well, the police court handled relatively minor cases, criminal and civil, and justice was transacted in this building for nearly 90 years, with some absences due to, I think there was a fire, there might have been renovations, and that's what the building looks like today. It's still there. It's right across from Brood Awakening on Market Street. Well, in 1924, the state legislature authorized the county commissioners of Middlesex County to borrow up to $250,000 for the creation of a Lowell District Court. And the commissioners were able to buy 2 adjoining parcels on Hurd Street. And in 1826, the Lowell District Court opened. Now, I think this is an architectural model of it, because when this building was constructed, there were other buildings on either side of it. It was a very tight fit. And so this building stayed like this until 1945, when the county commissioners acquired several lots behind this building on William Street. Nothing ever was built on them, but they continue to be used as parking space for the court. It wasn't until 1968 that Middlesex County took 2 parcels on either side of this building by eminent domain. and the district court that we know today was constructed. The east wing, which houses the probation department, that's the side near the parking garage, was added then. And the west wing, which now houses the clerk's office on the first floor and a jury courtroom on the second floor, were both added in 1968. It wasn't only small legal matters that arose out of Lowell. There was serious business, particularly with the explosive growth of the city. There was a lot of business litigation. There was a lot of crime. And so in the 1847, the state legislature authorized the construction of a superior court in Lowell. The Middlesex County Commissioners purchased a parcel of 100,000 square feet on what was called Chapel Hill. It's at the corner of Gorham Street and Elm Street. And they spent $100,000 building a 3-story red brick Romanesque revival style courthouse. It opened to much acclaim in 1848, and it still exists as the picture to your right of the cupola with the clock, the bell tower, the scales of justice, and the weather vane are the same ones that were there in 1848. In 1860, the county commissioners conveyed a portion of the lot, the downtown side of the parcel, to a group called the Trustees for the Creation of an Episcopal Church. And that's what became St. John's Episcopal Church, which is still there now, along with Linden Street, which separates the church from the court. The amount of business transacted in Lowell continued to increase. There was, as the 20th century approached, there was need for a bigger building. The original parcel was still about 85,000 square feet, was plenty big. And so the county commissioners added onto the courthouse. And we have this structure, which you see today. That was began in 1848 and it opened in 1898. And this is a picture shortly after it was it opened for business. And that's what it looks like today. Now, for some reason I haven't yet unearthed, the county commissioners decided not to add the new building onto the back of the existing building, but to move the existing building backwards and build the new building in front of it. And so the building on the left, the one from 1848, which was 3 stories tall, made of red bricks, was actually moved 60 feet backward. In a newspaper article from September of 1894, headlined, "Courthouse begins its journey to the new location," said that the work commenced on moving the courthouse today. The building is held up by 800 jacks, and other jacks are used to propel it backwards. It attained the rate of 1 inch per hour movement, and the progress was so slow and steady that work continued uninterrupted inside the Registry of Deeds. And if you scrutinize the building today, this is from the downtown side, you can see where the two buildings join together, the red brick building in the back and the sandstone building to the front. You can actually see the orange tinge from, I think that's part of the iron superstructure, has thrown off some rust. And this is from the other side that shows the bell tower, and again you can see the rust where the two buildings are joined together. Now, why they did this, as I said, is a mystery. I mean, one theory is that the contractor was the county commissioner's brother-in-law, but I like to think better of people. The 1890s is when a time when the immigrants arriving in Lowell in the United States weren't from Ireland or Canada. They were from Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. And there was a lot of concern at that time about anarchy and disregard of the rule of law. And when this building was dedicated in September of 1898, a lot of members of the bar got up and gave speeches about the dedication. And a theme that was running through those speeches was the importance of the rule of law and how the magnificence of this building communicates to everyone in the community that law is supreme and that anyone who violates the law will be dealt with appropriately. And so I think that was a concern. It was actually that the architecture send a message to the new inhabitants of the city. Now, the concern about anarchy existed in the 1890s, but it wasn't until the 1970s that it actually manifested itself. And on June 21st, 1976, a terrorist bomb exploded on the front steps of the Superior Courthouse in Lowell. I had always heard about this bombing of the courthouse, and so years ago when I started researching it, I went to the indexes of newspapers starting in 1967, which I thought was the year of great disruption, and I looked every year up till 72, 73, and I couldn't find anything. Well, for some reason, I kept looking, and it turned out to be 1976, which is a lot more recent than I would have thought. And what happened was there was a custodian who was arriving at work at 6 o'clock in the morning. He drove his car up Gorham Street. He noticed that there was a brown bag leaning against the front door of the courthouse. But he didn't think much of that because then, as today, people tend to leave brown bags filled with empties, maybe, lying around. Well, he drove around Elm Street, let himself in the side door, went to the inside of the front door, unlocked it, and just as he was about to open it, the bomb exploded. He was severely injured. He survived, although he was only 54 at the time, and he only lived for a few more years. A group called the Samuel Melville Jonathan Jackson Unit called and took responsibility for the bombing, and they were the ones who also had exploded a bomb at the Suffolk County Courthouse earlier that year. And so I like to keep this clipping handy in my office so anybody that complains about going through security entering the building is reminded that it is a real-world threat to judicial institutions. Now, with all that litigation, some people, unfortunately, well, let's start with this. The juvenile justice was always administered in the police court and the district court. About 10 or 15 years ago, the juvenile court went off on its own, and it located in the juvenile court building, which is at the corner of Appleton Street and Gorham Street. That building was originally constructed in 1894 as the post office in Lowell. And I just comment that that decade of the 1890s was a time of incredible construction of public buildings in Lowell. You not only had the addition to the Superior Court, 1894 to 1898, you had this building, the post office, 1894, but at the same time, Lowell City Hall and the Lowell Public Library, now known as the Pollard Library, were created. So there is just 4 public buildings, all built within 10 years of each other. As I started to say before, some people had to go to jail, and so Middlesex County decided to open a jail in Lowell. In 1847, at the same time they bought the land for the Superior Court, they purchased a parcel of 250,000 square feet from a guy named Ransom Reed for $4,000. That was on Thorndike Street, just across from the South Common. And they built what was then a state-of-the-art criminal holding facility, a jail. It had 90 cells for men, 12 cells for women. It had 2 separate hospitals or infirmaries, one for each gender. It had a couple of rooms that were for pretrial detainees, and it had quarters for the jailer who lived there around the clock. That was used as the county jail for many decades, and it was closed in 1919. And one commentator has said that the reason it closed was that too few people were being sentenced to jail, and that the reason for that was full employment from World War I. Everybody had jobs, so there was less time available for crime, and there was less motive for crime. Whatever the case, it closed in 1919. 5 years later, Middlesex County sold it to the Roman Catholic Archdiocese, or the Archbishop of Boston, for $38,000, and he opened it as Keith Academy. And the name Keith Academy comes because much of the funds used to build it were donated to the Archdiocese by a guy named B.F. Keith, who was a vaudeville theater entrepreneur, but he was also a devout Catholic who donated generously to the Archdiocese of Boston. This was not the first county jail in Lowell. It was a kind of a recent revelation to me. There was another one on Dutton Street. Now, we don't have an image of it, but in my mind, Dutton Street and Thorndike Street just blend in together, but that's not really the case. If you think of Dutton Street running from just in front of City Hall up to where the curve in the road occurs, where Thorndike Street begins, Dutton Street actually continues traveling to the west. It's where the old registry of motor vehicles was. I know when I got my license, that was Dutton Street. It still is Dutton Street. Well, if you can see this red arrow on this map from the 1837, that was the county jail. And that had been purchased from the proprietors of the locks and canals by Middlesex County, but it was only used for a dozen or so years as the jail, and then that jail further up Thorndike Street was created, and this one went into disuse and it was sold. If you think of where the Dunkin' Donuts is on Dutton Street, it was right in that vicinity is where this jail was. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about all of these parcels and these buildings is they might soon have to be referred to in the past tense, because this is an artist rendering of what the new Lowell Judicial Center is going to look like. It's kind of ironic, but if you took all of the buildings I've talked about and plotted them on a map and drew a circle, almost at the center of that circle is where this building is going to go. And that's at the end of Jackson Street, right off the Lord Overpass. It's going to cost $175 million to build. It's going to have almost 250,000 square feet of space, and it's estimated that it will open in 2018. Now, moving along, I'm going to a section which, a title I borrowed from Lou Eno. He once wrote a paper which he entitled Characters at the Bar. And this is a picture of the criminal courtroom in the Superior Court building up the street. And you can see the prominent wooden rail that encloses part of that courtroom. Well, that's the bar, and that's the origin of the phrase to pass the bar examination. When you pass the bar and you become a lawyer, you're able to go on the other side of that enclosure. And so that's the origin of the members of the bar. I think any discussion about anything in Lowell often starts with Ben Butler. He was born in Deerfield, New Hampshire. His father fought with Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. He was a privateer, but he caught yellow fever and died when Ben was only 8 or 9 years old. Ben, his widowed mother, and his older brothers all moved to Lowell, where the mother established she ran a boarding house. The mother wanted Ben to become a minister, so he went to a small biblical college in New Hampshire for a few years. He credits that with teaching him the art of rhetoric, although he thought his professional interests lie elsewhere. He returned to Lowell and he apprenticed in a law office in Lowell and became a lawyer. He became a member of the Mass Bar in 1840. He quickly became a very prominent attorney. Even though he became a major owner of the mills, he acquired a lot of mill stock, he also took on the rights of workers. He was particularly an advocate for the 10-hour day for employees, and that would be a reduction, not an increase in the hours back then. Ben also got involved in politics. He was a member of the state legislature. He ran for Congress. He ran for governor. After the Civil War, he was actually elected governor. He was elected to Congress, and he ran for the presidency in 1884. But I think the story I want to talk about actually comes out of his military service, which was decidedly mixed. I think Butler was a better administrator and legal mind when he was in uniform than he was a combat commander. And that manifested itself in a very important way in late May of 1861. The war was only about 6 weeks old, and Butler was assigned to command Fort Monroe. It was a key strategic installation at Hampton, Virginia, just across the opening of the bay from Norfolk, Virginia. And it was really surrounded by Confederate forces. It was the one Union foothold in the South. Well, Butler was its commander, and the Confederate forces that surrounded it on the peninsula were digging entrenchments. They were preparing for a siege of the fort. Well, they were using slaves to dig the trenches to advance closer to the walls of the fort. On the night of May 23rd, May 24th, 1861, 3 of these slaves escaped from the Confederate lines and showed up at the front door of the fort and asked for refuge. They were brought in before Butler, who'd only been there for 2 days. This was a very dicey area because the war, Lincoln made it very clear at the beginning that the war was not about freeing the slaves. And the reason he did that wasn't because he didn't think slavery was a bad thing. It was because to make the war anti-slavery would have alienated anti-abolitionist people in the North, but more importantly, it would have taken 3 border states, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, which had a high number of slave owners, and it probably would have pushed them into the South, which strategically would have made it almost impossible for the Union to win. And so how the issue of escaped slaves was treated was a very delicate issue, and the Union really didn't have a policy on it. And these 3 guys show up at Butler's desk in the middle of the night. Well, he calls upon his legal training, and he knows under the laws of warfare that the personal property of an enemy combatant that's being used to aid his military actions against you is subject to forfeiture as contraband of war under the laws of warfare. Because these slaves were deemed to be property by the Confederates, and they were clearly being used militarily against the Union Army, Butler declared them to be contraband of war, and he seized them. Of course, he fed them and did a number of other things with them, and he telegraphed Lincoln and said, "This is what I'm doing." And of course, all Lincoln's advisors were saying, "What's that crazy Butler doing now?" But Lincoln, being a lawyer, understood the logic behind it and adopted it as Union policy. And soon, slaves from all over the South who were near Union forces were fleeing, and they were being taken into Union control, and they were being cared for and paid salaries for working. And some historians now credit this with setting Lincoln on the pathway that led to the Emancipation Proclamation. Another lawyer in Lowell I'd like to talk about whose extra legal activities had international implications. Excuse me a second. All right, thanks. There's a guy named Frank Goldman. Frank Goldman was born in Lowell in 1890. His parents were Jews who had immigrated from Poland. He graduated from Lowell High School in 1907 and Boston University Law School in 1910. He became a member of the Massachusetts Bar. He was a very prominent, successful attorney. But in 1947 to 1950, he became the international president of the B'nai B'rith organization, the Jewish support organization. And this was a time when Israel was seeking international recognition as an independent country. Well, many people were lobbying President Truman to endorse that proposition, but the U.S. State Department was adamantly opposed to it. And at a really delicate time, when time was of the essence, Truman sided with the State Department and said, "All right, I'm not going to sign the recognition document." Well, Goldman knew that something had to be done. He also knew that in Kansas City, the home of Harry Truman, there was a guy named Eddie Jacobson. Well, in World War I, Eddie Jacobson had served in the National Guard unit, the same one as Harry Truman, and they had become great friends. In fact, after the war, they joined together to open up a clothing store. You're probably familiar with the from Harry Truman's brief biography that he was a haberdasher that declared bankruptcy, a men's clothing store. Well, he did declare bankruptcy, but his partner was this guy, Eddie Jacobson, and they remained lifelong friends. In fact, Jacobson had an open invitation to come to the White House anytime he wanted. With Goldman, and Jacobson also, he was a member of B'nai B'rith, even though he wasn't particularly active or outspoken on issues about Israel. Well, what Goldman did was he got on a plane and flew to Kansas City, and in the middle of the night he shows up at Eddie Jacobson's house. And he used his skills and his persuasiveness as a lawyer to convince Jacobson to fly back to Washington with him and to go see President Truman. Jacobson agreed. He shows up at the White House. Truman's delighted to see his old friend. When Jacobson starts pitching the pro-Israeli line, Truman gets very upset. But I guess that was Truman's manner, and he quickly calmed down, and he understood Jacobson's reasoning, and he said, okay, you win. I'll sign the document. The document was prepared, and Eddie Jacobson and Frank Goldman stood right behind Harry Truman when he signed the document that recognized Israel by the United States. And they each were given one of the pens that was used to sign that document. Frank Goldman returned to Lowell, continued as a local lawyer. His son, Robert Goldman, entered the firm, which was with Jim Curtis, and the firm of Goldman and Curtis continues today under Greg Curtis, which is Jim's son. Frank Goldman died in the mid-1960s, I believe. Many of you may have heard of the firm Claw, Hall, Harvey, and Walsh, with Jim Hall, the elder, and the younger, that's still in existence. Well, not the founding member, but one of the early attorneys who worked there was a guy named Stanley Claw. Stanley was born in Lowell in 1880. He was a graduate of Lowell High, Dartmouth College, and Harvard Law School. His father was a lawyer, and his brother was actively involved in this firm, so Stanley joined the firm. But in 1921, he was appointed to the Superior Court. 13 years later, in 1934, he was appointed to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. And in 1947, he was made the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which makes him one of a very important lawyer and judge in the state. He retired in 1956 at age 76. A profile that appeared in the Boston Globe when he was first appointed interviewed a number of people who knew him, and he was described as being serene and steady. When he was on the Superior Court bench, he concentrated on equity cases, and no one ever remembered him trying a murder case. But he's said by some to be the second most important Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court after Lemuel Shaw, who was from the early days. I guess Justice Claw was quite a walker. He lived on Holyrood Ave, and so every day he would walk from his house to the train station to take the train into Boston for court. Many of you might remember John E Leggett, the colored picture up to the right. He died in 2004. He was a great guy, a great lawyer who had an office here in Lowell. Well, his father was also a lawyer who became a judge, and he holds the record for the longest serving probate court judge in the history of Massachusetts. John Cochran Leggett was born in 1883. His family lived on Middlesex Street. His father was a machinist. He went to Lowell High, Boston University Law School, and he went into private practice. When World War I started and America got involved, he enlisted. He became an officer. He rose to the rank of captain. He was assigned to the 26th Yankee Division. He saw much frontline action in France. And when he came back in 1919, Calvin Coolidge, the governor, appointed him to the probate court when he was only 36 years old. So Judge Leggett served from 1919 up until 1967, when he retired at the age of 84. And an article upon his retirement after 40 years on the bench said that other than his white hair He looked as spry and as vigorous as the day that he was discharged from the Army. He died in 1974. Then we have this friend, good friend of mine, who's retired and living in Westford, and that's Lou Eno. It's a picture of he and I in 1995, right after I became Register of Deeds. Lou is recognized as one of the foremost authorities in Massachusetts on real estate law. In fact, he co-authored the volume of the Massachusetts Practice Series on real estate. But locally, he's also known as a historian. He was the president of the Lowell Historical Society. He was very involved in the organization. And he was a member of the Bicentennial Sesquicentennial Commission for Lowell back as we neared 1976. He may even have been the chair of that organization. And it was decided by that group collectively that the Lowell Historic Society's contribution to the sesquicentennial from 1826 to 1976 and the bicentennial was to write a much needed history of Lowell called Cotton Was King. Lou served as the editor. He himself wrote 2 chapters, one on the Civil War and one that was kind of an intellectual history of the Mill Girls, but he edited a book of 14 chapters by 11 different authors, which was a tall order. And it was a wonderful product that's added much to Lowell's historiography. Like John Leggett, Lou's father was also a judge. His father's name was also Arthur L. Eno. He was born in 1892. He went to Lowell High School, Harvard Law School. He became a member of the bar in 1914. He enlisted in the Army in the Quartermaster Corps. He started as a private. He went to Officer Candidate School, and he was assigned to the Quartermaster General's office in Washington. After the war, he resumed his legal practice, but he was appointed in 1920 to be the chair of the Lowell Auditorium Commission, the entity that oversaw the construction of the Lowell Memorial Auditorium, which was constructed in honor of veterans of all wars, but particularly those from World War I. 1927, he was appointed to the Lowell District Court, and he became the presiding justice in 1944. And he served right up until his death in 1965. He didn't feel well one day. He was on the bench. He went to the hospital, and he died within a couple of days. Now, the same day that Judge Eno was appointed as a judge in 1927, a man named James E. O'Donnell was also made a judge at the Lowell District Court. O'Donnell was about 20 years older than Eno. He had been born in Lowell in 1875. His father's name was James F. O'Donnell, who was a funeral director, and that's where the current funeral home got its name. James went to St. Patrick's Grammar School, Lowell High School, BU Law School, which he graduated in 1903. He became a member of the Massachusetts Bar. He ran for state representative in 1907, won a very close race, winning by only 44 votes. He served as mayor of Lowell in 1912, 1916, and as I said, he was appointed as a judge in 1927. He retired from the bench in 1943 and relocated to Florida. And when he died in 1966, a nephew of his, who was on the city council, named Thomas O'Donnell, made a motion that the School Street Bridge, or the Pawtucket Bridge, be renamed in his honor. So the bridge that connects School Street to Mammoth Road since 1968 has been known as the James E. O'Donnell Bridge. And this is who it is named for. Next, I want to talk about these 3 brothers who may have been certainly the most prominent threesome of family-connected lawyers in 19th century Lowell, Daniel, William, and George Richardson. They all were born in Tingsboro, but they all had their practices here in Lowell. Daniel was the oldest. He was born in 1816. He went to Harvard. He became a member of the Mass Bar in 1839. And he practiced law in Lowell for 50 years. He died in 1890. In addition to his law practice, he served on the city council, he was a county commissioner, he was a member of the state legislature, he was president or a trustee of countless businesses, banks, railroads, nonprofits. He was very active in the community. But I think what he was best known for is being a mentor for generation after generation of lawyers. In fact, a month after he died, the state Supreme Judicial Court was sitting here in Lowell at the Superior Courthouse, and the Chief Justice at the time was Oliver Wendell Holmes. And the opening day of the session wasn't devoted to any judicial business, it was devoted to a memorial for Daniel Richardson. And all of the judges and prominent lawyers from Lowell, including Ben Butler, gave up and gave eulogies. And Justice Holmes himself gave a eulogy talking about his very impressive dealings with Daniel Richardson. The next brother in age was William. He was born in 1821, became a member of the bar in 1846. He served on the Lowell City Council. 1856, he became a probate judge here in Massachusetts. But in 1869, President Grant selected him to be an assistant secretary of the Treasury, and in 1873, Grant made him the secretary of the Treasury. He only served in that for about 14 or 15 months, however, when Grant appointed him to the Court of Claims in Washington, D.C., a federal appellate court, and he eventually became the chief judge of that court. George Richardson was the youngest brother. He was born in 1829. He was a very prominent lawyer. During the Civil War, he excelled at recruiting troops. They didn't have a draft till the very end, so they relied on community leaders to recruit people into units, the newly formed units. And one company of infantry that was created called itself the Richardson Light Infantry. And for decades after the war, they had all kinds of reunions where George Richardson was always their honored guest. He was, as I said, a very prominent lawyer, and he did a lot of probate work. And it was in 1886 that the Middlesex Probate Court appointed him to be the executor of the estate of a woman named Louisa Maria Wells. Now, Louisa Maria Wells died having a substantial estate, which was unique at the time because she was a mill girl her entire life. She was born in Vermont in 1816. She came to Lowell as a teenager and worked in the mills her entire life. She never married, she had no siblings, she had no children, but each time she got paid, she'd put a few dollars in the bank so that when she died in 1886, she had $8,000 in the bank. Before her death, she had done two things. One is she purchased a cemetery plot in the Lowell Cemetery, and she also made out a will. And in the will, she said that after all of the expenses of administration of her estate and her debts were paid, her entire residue of her estate should be used to build an appropriate monument for her in the Lowell Cemetery. She died. She didn't have any siblings, but she had some cousins, and the cousins thought that her money could be better spent on them, so they contested the will. George Richardson represented the estate as the executor, and it took 20 years to adjudicate the case. One of my objectives is to go to the archives and dig out the case and look at all the pleadings to figure out why it took that long, but it did. The good thing about that was that caused the money to accumulate a tremendous amount of interest. So when the court finally issued its final ruling, Richardson contacted Daniel Chester French, who was perhaps the foremost sculptor in America at the time, and asked him to do the monument. And I've learned in this research that Richardson was somehow related to French, so there was an additional connection. French said, no, I'm too busy, I've got too many contracts to do, but I've got a very talented young associate by the name of Evelyn Longman, who I recommend to you. Evelyn Longman was born in Chicago. She was a graduate of the Art Institute of Chicago. She's a hugely talented artist, but she had difficulty getting work because she was a woman. Richardson hired her, and Longman created this monument. It's called, has this figure of an angel touching the reclining figure of a mill worker, and this is in the Lowell Cemetery. This was one of Evelyn Longman's earliest works. It was highly publicized, and it helped build her reputation, and she went on to do much more publicly prominent pieces of art. Well, and that's the story, that's an example of George Richardson's probate expertise, but he also did some litigation. And one of his litigation clients was a guy named Augustine Thompson. He was a doctor, came to Lowell after the Civil War, and like many other doctors at the time, he concocted a medicine. And he called the medicine Moxie nerve food. And he sold it as a medicine, and it was so successful that he went into business of producing it full time. And when the United States government instituted the Pure Food and Drug Act and made it tougher to sell medicine, he diluted the medicine with soda water, bottled it, and sold it as a soft drink called Moxie. So that's the guy, if you haven't been on my cemetery tour, that's the guy that invented Moxie. Well, Thompson, besides being a doctor and a medicine inventor, fancied himself to be something of a playwright. And in 1881, he wrote a play that he titled Xena the Slave Girl. And he went about recruiting actresses to star in it. And he found this woman who we eventually learned name is Myra Beals, an attractive young woman. According to Thompson, she did a great job in the play, but she was a little rough around the edges, so she needed some professional training. He said that he agreed to pay for her acting lessons, elocution lessons, and to provide for her until she could get on her feet professionally, at which time she could pay him back all of this money. Well, Myra had a slightly different story. Myra said that she did apply for the actress, the role. She was granted it, that they were somewhat on friendly terms. She said once they kissed, although I never went any further than that, that she traveled around the East Coast. Anytime she asked Thompson for money for new dresses or for lodging or accommodations, he'd send her $25, $100, really whatever she wanted. They engaged in kind of a steamy correspondence back and forth. But that all changed when Myra met Mr. Beals, who was a retired businessman who lived in Brookline. They were engaged and married within 2 weeks. When Dr. Thompson learned of the marriage, his tone of his letters changed somewhat. He began writing demanding the repayment of all the money that he had paid to her. And in the letters, he ridiculed her elderly husband and said some other unkind things about Mr. Beals. Well, somehow or other, Mr. Beals discovered these letters, read them, and according to Myra, he began treating her unkindly himself. So unkindly, in fact, that Myra filed for divorce, alleging abusive treatment and impotency, just for good grounds. She was granted the divorce from Mr. Beals, and then she immediately turned around and sued Augustine Thompson for alienation of affections. The main evidence in this trial were these letters, which were steamy and probably incriminating. Of course, Dr. Thompson, in his testimony, was able to explain them all away, but in the end, the jury found in favor of Myra Beals and awarded her $30,000 in damages. Dr. Thompson then sued his lawyer, George and he was able to obtain an attachment against Attorney Richardson's property, but I haven't found the end result of that suit yet. Now, the more perceptive of you might have noticed that everyone I've talked about now is a man, other than the mill girl and the society woman Myra Beals. Catherine Goodwin, the historian who originated the Lowell Cemetery tours and really made one of her projects in life studying the role of women in 19th and early 20th century Lowell, had long maintained that we really failed to appreciate the important place in women in public life in Lowell. One example Catherine used to use was actually the wife of George Richardson, the lawyer who had the unfortunate client, Dr. Thompson. Her name was Carolyn Richardson. She was involved in all kinds of causes. She was a founder of the Lowell Humane Society. She was one of the founders of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. She was a suffragette. She was a strong advocate for the right of women to vote. Fortunately, she lived until 1922, so she was able to cast a vote after the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote in 1920. But Carolyn wasn't involved in the law. But there was a woman lawyer in Lowell in the 19th century, and her name was Alice Parker. Alice was born in Lowell in 1864. Her father's name was Hiram Parker. He was a pretty prominent doctor. And Alice wanted to follow in her father's footsteps. So when she graduated from Lowell High School, she planned to go to medical school. But her father died suddenly, and he left a pretty sizable estate. She was an only child, and while her mother was still alive, it fell upon Alice to manage all of the property in the estate. So she thought that rather than go to medical school, she should educate herself in the kind of things that are necessary to manage a lot of property. And so she started legal studies. She wasn't in particularly good health, so in the late 1880s, she went to San Francisco, hoping for a change in climate would help her out. It was there that she went to work at a law office, and she was trained in the law, and she passed the California bar. Well, her mother's health started to decline, so in 1890, Alice came back to Lowell to care for her mother. She also became a member of the Massachusetts bar then. She handled all kinds of cases, but she really specialized in probate cases. And she had a very big practice with offices both in Lowell and Boston. And one of the reasons for that, she was a regular columnist for a major magazine that was published in Boston. And the name of her column was Law for My Sisters. And it was an advice column explaining to women their property rights, rights under divorce, marriage, and things like that. And so she was kind of a groundbreaker. Now, I kind of appeared on the scene in the legal community in 1984. I was in law school then. I became a member of the bar in 1986. And certainly by 1984, there were a number of women lawyers, but they, at least immediately prior to that, or up until prior to that, they had a tough time. Somebody shared with me a newspaper article from 1977. It was about women becoming more involved in prosecuting cases with the district attorney's office and defending cases. And what struck me about the article was not only the important cases these women lawyers were handling, but the whole thrust of the article was, well, how do you know what to wear to court? Or how do you, isn't this unfair to your kids when you leave them every day to go in this kind of a stressful environment? So 1977 isn't that long ago. And so I think, fortunately, since then, there's been a sea change. And I guess just calling upon my own experience, three people I'd like to point out, and a fourth I'd like to name that maybe helped that along. One was Kathy O'Donnell, who's still an active lawyer. She's a past president of the Massachusetts Bar Association, the Lowell Bar Association, and the Massachusetts Academy of Trial Attorneys. Barbara Pearson, who's a district court judge. June Gonzalez, who's a probate judge. And there's Mary Ann Sahavian, who I was not able to find a picture of, who's also a probate judge. And I think the gender balance of the bar is much more equal now. And I don't think that the women lawyers today are confronted with the same questions that their colleagues from a couple of decades ago were. But all of these women who were practicing when I started almost 30 years ago really symbolized excellence and professionalism in the field. And that's something that runs throughout, I think, the history of of the legal community in Lowell. One group that I would like to single out, and is because mostly what I did in the 8 years I practiced law before becoming Registry of Deeds was criminal defense work. And that's the people who served at the Committee for Public Counsel Services at the time. Sometimes that's it's an important function in society to make sure those that are accused of crime get adequate representation. Well, those accused of crimes in Lowell who were assigned any of these lawyers got much more than adequate representation. They got excellent representation. And Carney Daniels was the kind of the quarterback at the Lowell District Court. Dan Callahan, Mike Lappin, who is Paul's brother, Jack Glue, and Kathy Byrne all did an excellent job. I know any time when two people commit a crime, the same office can't represent them both. So I often found myself representing a co-defendant with one of the 5 of these people. And it was always a very educational and rewarding experience for me. I'd also like to recognize a couple of judges. I think today judges have it really tough because there's more of a business school mentality that's brought to the administration of justice, that they're governed by statistics and maybe not, and I think they do the best they can under the circumstances. But when I was beginning, I think judges were a lot better able to bring compassion into the equation. And it was compassion not just for the litigants and the defendants, it was also compassion for the lawyers who were trying to eke out a living in a tough business. And 3 that just come to mind were Elliot Cowdery, Frank Lappin, and David Williams. Another person who I put in that category is Nicholas Vergados, who's also a judge of the Industrial Accident Commission. He's the man who's shaking hands with a youngish-looking Michael Dukakis, who was the governor who appointed him. To Vergados' right is Paul Tsongas. The man in the rust-colored suit behind Dukakis is Leo Farley, who was the mayor of Lowell. I guess, does anybody want to, could we play, guess who, identify the people? Well, Father Sorrentos is on the left. I think, is that John Duff, the second from the right, from the UMass Lowell? I think the one on the right is a judge as well. And so anyway, that was when Commissioner Nick Vergados was sworn in as a member of the Industrial Accident Commission. And finally, I want to talk about the Lowell Bar Association. This picture, I think, is from the 1930s. I only know 2 of the people. To the far right is a guy named Morris Barlowski, and next to him is a gentleman named Sidney Rindler, who shared office space with my dad for many decades, and he died in the 1990s. Before I ask you to identify the other 4 gentlemen in the picture, I just wanted to talk about the Bar Association, the importance of it. The highlight of the year was always the annual outing at Vesper, where people who like to play golf played golf, people who like to play tennis, and people who like to play cards played cards all day. There'd be a dinner in the evening with a prominent guest speaker, and then everybody would play cards afterwards. And I think it was a kind of a camaraderie that I think still exists today, but it's harder to find today. And I think it's one that the people who are in the leadership position of the bar are trying very hard to emulate. Do we have any volunteers who can identify any of the people in this picture?
Nick Dukakis
is
2 away from Sydney.
Okay, so he's the one with the hat in his left hand and the cigar. Okay. Well, I've posted this picture on my website, which is richardhowe.com. So if any of you are too shy to speak out or you want to double check your answers, just visit that and leave a comment. In conclusion, there's a couple of people I'd like to thank, and I'll just rattle off their names: Brian Leahy, Phil Nyman, Dan Callahan, Anna Rapucci Vergados, Dan Rourke, Arlene Boone, Eileen Lou Craft, Gray Fitzsimmons, Lou Eno, and Marie Sweeney helped me out this morning after I did this slide done. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments you may have, but thank you very much for coming today.